Earth's shipyards suddenly shut down. The aliens celebrated until they saw what humanity launched. High above the blue and green curve of Earth, a Scarn observation drone drifted in silence. It had done this for 6 years, watching the same patch of orbital space above the Pacific Ocean, where the great human shipyards of Meridian Station had once glowed with welding light day and night. Tonight, for the first time since the drone had been placed there, the lights were gone. Ambassador Kalith Dronin received the report while sitting in his private chamber aboard the Concorde flagship. Silent judgment. He was an old Veltharn, his skin the color of dull copper, his 4 eyes moving independently as he read the data scrolling across his screen. He called for his aide, a younger Veltharn named Usa, and asked her to confirm the report herself. "It is confirmed, Ambassador," Usa said. "Meridian Station has gone dark. No construction activity for 11 days. The same is true of the Novosibirsk yards, the Cape Canaveral complex, and the Lagrange 2 foundry. All 4 of the human race's major shipbuilding centers have stopped producing." Kalith folded his long fingers together. For 6 years, since the end of what the humans called the First Contact War, the Ashen Concorde had squeezed Earth carefully. Not with open war. Humanity had proven, in that short and bloody conflict, that it could bite back harder than any species the Concorde had encountered in 3,000 years of expansion. But there were other ways to weaken a young species. Trade restrictions, quotas on how many warships Earth was permitted to build, tariffs on the rare minerals humanity needed to keep its fleet running. Slowly, patiently, the Concorde had been tightening a rope around Earth's throat, waiting for the moment when the rope would finally choke the life from human ambition. "Perhaps," Kalith said slowly, "the rope has done its work." Word spread through the Concorde fleet faster than any official announcement could travel. On the mess decks of 100 warships, soldiers of a dozen different species began to whisper the news to each other. The humans, it seemed, could no longer afford to build. Their economy, strangled by years of sanctions, had finally broken. The species that had shocked the galaxy by fighting the Concorde to a standstill was, in the end, just another young race that could be starved into submission. On the human side of things, the mood was very different, though only a small number of people knew why. 200 kilometers beneath the surface of the Nevada desert, in a chamber cut from solid granite and sealed behind 3 meters of reinforced alloy, Dr. Marcus Chen stood in front of a wall of monitors and allowed himself, for the first time in 4 years, to smile without worry creasing his forehead. "Report," he said to the technician beside him, a woman named Priya Nair, who had not slept properly in 3 days. "Forge Array 7 is at 98% output," Priya said. "The last 2 hull sections for the Vindication class are complete. We're ready to begin final assembly on schedule." Marcus nodded and looked at the screen that showed a live feed from far below them, where enormous robotic arms moved through vast chambers carved from the bedrock of the planet. Arms that belonged to a system he and his team had spent 4 years building in total secrecy. It was called the Forge, and it was not a shipyard in the way that humans had once understood shipyards. There were no dock workers welding plates by hand. There were no slow assembly lines stretching across kilometers of open space, where alien satellites could count every rivet. Instead, there were self-replicating manufacturing cells, seeded 8 years ago with a single prototype design, that had spent years quietly multiplying beneath the surface of 6 different continents, hidden from every eye in the sky, drawing power from geothermal taps and fusion cores, buried even deeper than the forge itself. Marcus had been a junior propulsion engineer when the First Contact War began. He remembered watching human ships, brave but outdated, hold the line against Concorde warships, with technology centuries more advanced. Humanity had won that war, if it could be called winning, only because the Concorde had underestimated human stubbornness, and because Earth's scientists had improvised weapons the Concorde had never seen before. But everyone who understood the numbers knew that if the Concorde had committed its full strength, Earth would have been glassed within a month. The war had ended in an uneasy truce, only because the Concorde, cautious after unexpected losses, decided that squeezing Earth slowly was safer than a costly full invasion. Marcus had been in the room, 6 years ago, when the President and the Joint Chiefs met with a strange coalition of scientists, engineers, and one very unusual guest. That guest had been a Trenai defector named Sassafel, a being from a species allied with the Concorde who had, for reasons of her own, decided that the Concorde's slow strangling of a young species disgusted her. Sasafel had brought with her fragments of Concorde manufacturing technology far beyond anything humanity possessed. It was not a weapon, it was better than a weapon. It was a way of building weapons faster than any species in the galaxy had ever built them before. The human government made a decision that day that very few people ever learned about. They would comply, publicly, with every Concorde demand. They would let their visible shipyards produce exactly the number of ships the treaty allowed, no more. They would let Concorde inspectors walk through Meridian Station and Novosibirsk and Cape Canaveral and count every hull, every engine, every gun. And deep beneath the surface of the Earth, in 6 locations, chosen for their geological stability and their distance from any surface activity, they would begin something the Concorde could never imagine. They called it Project Anvil. For 4 years, the surface shipyards had continued their slow, treaty-approved production, giving the Concorde exactly the picture it wanted to see. A young species building ships at a pace that could never threaten the Concorde's dominance. Meanwhile, far below, the forge grew. It replicated its own manufacturing cells, the way a seed grows into a forest, cell by cell, chamber by chamber, until 6 continents held facilities that could produce more warship tonnage in a month than Meridian Station had produced in its entire operational history. The final piece of Project Anvil was not the ships themselves, though the ships were the culmination of everything humanity had learned in 6 brutal years. The final piece was the decision of when to stop the visible shipyards and reveal nothing. That decision had been made 11 days ago. "They think we're broke," said General Elena Voss, standing at the back of the control room with her arms crossed. She had been the ranking officer in the room the day Sasafel arrived, and she had aged 10 years in the 6 since, though her back remained as straight as a rifle barrel. Ambassador Dronin's people intercepted a dozen private communications from Concorde officers, celebrating. "They think the shipyards shut down because we ran out of money to keep them running." "Let them think that," Marcus said. "It's exactly what we wanted." Elena walked to the window that looked down into the observation gallery above the forge's primary assembly chamber. Even from here, 3 levels up, she could see the shapes of the first. Vindication. Class hulls taking form, longer and stranger than any human warship that had come before them, their hulls a matte black material that absorbed rather than reflected the harsh worklights around them. "How many?" she asked. "Will be ready for the first launch." 12, Marcus said. 12. Vindication. Class cruisers, each one carrying weapons and armor beyond anything in the treaty registry, because none of this was ever registered. And that's just the first wave. The forge doesn't stop growing, General. It's already seeding new manufacturing cells in 3 more locations. Within a year, we could have 60 of these ships. Within 2 years, 600. Elena was quiet for a long moment. She had spent 6 years pretending to negotiate with an alien species that saw humanity as a stubborn but ultimately manageable problem. 6 years of humiliating quotas and condescending inspections. 6 years of watching Concorde diplomats smile the particular smile of someone who believes they have already won. She had swallowed her pride more times than she could count, because she had known, the entire time, what was growing in the dark beneath her feet. "When do we tell the president it's time?" she asked. "The moment the Concorde makes its move," Marcus said. Sasafel warned us that a species like the Concorde doesn't celebrate a rival's weakness quietly. They'll want to make sure. And the only way an old, proud coalition like the Concorde makes sure a weakened species stays weakened is to finish the job. He was right, though neither of them yet knew exactly how right he was. Aboard the Silent Judgment. Ambassador Kaleth Dronin convened an emergency session of the Concorde War Council, 3 days after the shipyards went dark. The council chamber was a wide amphitheater, built to hold delegates from every species in the coalition. The armored, insectile Chit, the tall, silent Osun, who communicated in slow bioluminescent pulses, the aggressive, wolf-like Kargan, who had never fully trusted the peace with Earth, and had spent 6 years arguing for a second war. All of them turned their attention, in their different ways, toward Kaleth as he stood to speak. "Our long patience with the human species has borne fruit," Kaleth said. and his translated voice carried a note of quiet triumph across the chamber. Intelligence confirms that all 4 of humanity's declared shipbuilding facilities have ceased operation. Economic analysis suggests total collapse of their war economy. The humans can no longer sustain the fleet they currently possess, let alone expand it. A representative of the Kargan stood, his fur bristling, his sharp teeth visible even through the translation module strapped to his throat. "Then it is time," he growled. 6 years we have waited, restrained by treaties with a species that should never have been allowed to survive its first contact with us. If they are broken, there is no reason for further restraint. The Kargan delegate is, for once, not entirely wrong, Calith said, ignoring the flicker of insult that crossed the Kargan's face. A weakened rival is a temporary condition. Humans are resourceful. If we do not act while they are at their lowest, they may recover. I propose we begin preparations for what our human observers, with their peculiar sense of humor, might have called a victory lap. Laughter rippled through the chamber in a dozen different forms. Barks, clicks, pulses of colored light. "I will not call it an invasion," Calith continued, "because an invasion implies resistance. I call it a correction. We will move the 3rd and 9th conquered fleets into human space. We will demand the full and immediate surrender of Earth's remaining military assets. If they resist, which I do not expect, we will remind them precisely why the galaxy fears the Ashen Concord." The vote was not close. Within the hour, orders went out to 2 fleets totaling over 400 warships, more than enough, by any Concord officer's calculation, to reduce Earth's remaining defenses to scrap in a matter of days. The fleets began to move, gathering at a staging point 3 light-years from Sol, preparing for what every soldier aboard those ships believed would be a short, one-sided campaign against a species too broken to fight back. None of them knew about the Forge. None of them knew about Project Anvil. None of them knew that somewhere on a planet they believed was crawling on its knees, a woman named Elena Voss was watching sensor reports of Concord fleet movements with an expression that was not fear, but something closer to relief. "They're coming," she said, when Marcus Chen answered her call, just like Sassafel said they would. "Good," Marcus said, and there was no fear in his voice either. "Then it's time to wake the rest of the Forge up, all of it." Far below the surface of 6 continents, in chambers that had spent 4 years building in silence, alarms that had never once sounded began to hum quietly to life. Assembly arms that had moved with patient, unhurried precision began to move faster. Lights that had never been meant for Concord satellites to see flared on in facilities that did not appear on any registered map of Earth's industry. The first. Vindication. Class cruiser, a ship called the Meridian's Answer. In honor of the shipyard that had spent 6 years pretending to be humanity's entire war effort, prepared for its maiden launch. It would not be the last ship to leave the Forge. It would not even be the most powerful. But it would be the first thing the Concord fleet saw when they arrived, expecting to find a broken and defenseless world. Ambassador Calith Dronin, aboard the Silent Judgment. 3 days into the fleet's journey toward Sol, allowed himself a private moment of satisfaction as he reviewed the timeline for what he still refused to call an invasion. 6 years of patience, 6 years of careful strangulation, were finally about to pay their dividend. He composed a short message to the Concord High Council, a message he was quite proud of, informing them that the human problem would be resolved within the week. He had no way of knowing that the message he should have sent, if he had understood what was waiting for him, would have read very differently. Somewhere beneath the Nevada desert, Marcus Chen stood in front of a screen showing the first completed hull of the Meridian's Answer. Its black surface catching the work lights like a piece of the night sky brought down to earth, and he thought of the 6 years of quiet humiliation, 6 years of watching his country pretend to be weak, while it grew strong in secret, and he said quietly, to no one but himself, "Let them come and see." 4 years before the shipyards went dark, in a small, windowless room beneath what used to be a decommissioned missile silo in North Dakota, a defector named Sassafel sat across a metal table from General Elena Voss and told her a story that would change the fate of Earth. Sassafel was a Trinai, a species that looked, to human eyes, something like a cross between a heron and a lizard, with long, slender limbs, feathered ridges along her skull, and pale gold eyes that missed nothing. She had served the Ashen Concord for over 200 years as a logistics officer, one of thousands of Trenai who kept the vast machinery of Concord expansion running smoothly. She spoke standard English with careful precision, having spent 3 years secretly studying human transmissions before she made her decision to defect. The Concord does not conquer with armies first, Sassafel told Elena, through the humming static of a translation device that still had trouble with some Trenai vowel sounds. It conquers with patience. It finds young species, still fighting among themselves, still building their first crude ships, and it waits. It offers trade. It offers technology, just enough to make itself useful, never enough to make the young species dangerous. And when the young species has grown comfortable, dependent, weak, in the ways that matter, the Concord tightens its grip until there is no fight left in them at all. That's not what happened with us, Elena said. We fought back. You did, Sassafel said, and something that might have been respect flickered across her long face. You fought back in a way no species has in 3 centuries of Concord expansion. That is why the High Council is afraid of you, General Voss, even as they pretend not to be. That is why they chose slow strangulation instead of a second war. They do not want to lose more ships to a species with your particular stubbornness. But do not mistake caution for mercy. They intend to finish what they started. They are simply willing to wait longer to do it safely. Elena had leaned back in her chair that day and asked the question that mattered most. Why are you telling us this? Sassafel's answer had taken nearly an hour, and it was the answer that led, eventually, to Project Anvil. The Trenai, it turned out, were not merely servants of the Concord. They were its engineers, the species responsible for designing and maintaining the Concord's manufacturing infrastructure, including a technology called the Vel Forge, a self-replicating industrial system capable of producing warships at a speed no other species in the galaxy could match. The technology had been in Concord hands for over 1,000 years, carefully restricted, given only to species the Concord trusted completely, species that had already been broken to the Concord's will centuries before humanity ever built its first satellite. Sassafel had spent 200 years watching the Concord use this technology to conquer, absorb, and slowly erase the culture of one species after another, all while calling it partnership, all while calling it protection. She had watched them do it to her own ancestors, 400 years before her birth, until the Trenai forgot they had ever been anything but useful servants of an empire that did not love them. I am old, General Voss, Sassafel said. Older than I look, by your standards. I have watched this pattern too many times to count. I do not expect to change the Concord. It is too large, too old, too certain of its own righteousness. But I am tired of watching young species be ground down slowly, told the whole time that this is simply the natural order of a galaxy too dangerous for gentleness. I have brought you fragments of Velforge technology, incomplete, encrypted in ways only Trenai engineers can fully unlock. I offer to help you build something the Concord has never had to face, a young species with old technology, moving faster and more secretly than they believe possible. It took Marcus Chen, then a junior engineer with a reputation for stubborn brilliance, 11 months to fully decrypt the fragments Sassafel had brought. It took him and a team of 400 hand-picked scientists and engineers, sworn to secrecy under penalty of treason, another 2 years to adapt Velforge principles into something that could be built with human materials, human power sources, and human ingenuity, because the original technology assumed resources and manufacturing bases far beyond anything Earth possessed. What they built instead was, in some ways, better suited to humanity's situation than the original Velforge had ever been to the Concords. The Concord built the Velforge in the open, on planets and stations it had already conquered, with no need for secrecy. Humanity had to build something that could hide. Marcus called the human version the Forge, dropping the alien prefix because, as he told his team more than once, this one is ours now. The Forge worked by seeding a single, self-contained manufacturing cell deep underground, a cell that used local geothermal energy and a small fusion core to slowly replicate its own components, growing new cells the way a coral reef grows new branches, each new cell adding manufacturing capacity without any need for human labor beyond initial setup and monitoring. It was slow at first, agonizingly slow, taking 8 months to produce its first replicated cell. But growth compounds. By the second year, new cells were appearing every 6 weeks. By the third year, every 12 days. By the fourth year, the 6 forge sites scattered beneath 6 continents were producing new manufacturing capacity, faster than any human engineer could fully track, without the aid of the specialized AI systems built specifically to manage it. The greatest challenge was never the technology itself, though the technology was hard enough. The greatest challenge was secrecy. Concorde observation satellites watched Earth constantly, a legal right guaranteed under the treaty that ended the First Contact War, a right the Concorde had insisted upon, specifically so it could monitor Earth's compliance with shipbuilding quotas. Every visible shipyard, every declared production facility, was watched around the clock by orbital sensors, sensitive enough to count individual welders on a hull. Hiding an underground manufacturing base from that kind of scrutiny required more than just digging deep, though the forge facilities were indeed built far deeper than any human mining operation had ever gone. It required hiding the energy signatures, the heat bloom, the vibration patterns that any sufficiently advanced sensor array might notice if it looked in the right place at the right time. Dr. Amara Osei, a geophysicist recruited into Project Anvil in its second year, solved much of this problem by burying the forge facilities near existing geothermal and volcanic zones, places where unusual heat and vibration readings would already be expected and explained by natural processes. The forge beneath Nevada was built near an old volcanic field. The forge beneath Iceland was built into the side of an active fault zone. The forge beneath the Andes drew power from geothermal vents that had confused surface sensors for decades before Project Anvil ever existed. "We are hiding a forest inside a jungle," Amara told the project's oversight committee during a tense budget review in the second year, when several senators privately worried the entire project was a waste of resources that would eventually be discovered anyway. "The Concorde is looking for the shape of a shipyard. We are giving them nothing that looks like a shipyard at all." It worked, though it worked only because Elena Voss and a small circle of senior officials made sure the surface shipyards continued their treaty-approved production without interruption, giving Concorde inspectors exactly what they expected to see every single time they demanded an inspection. Elena herself walked Concorde officers through Meridian Station a dozen times over 4 years, watching them count hulls and engines, with the particular condescension of a species convinced it already understood everything important about the species it was inspecting. "They never once asked why our production numbers stayed exactly at the treaty limit," Elena told Marcus one night in the third year of the project, both of them exhausted after an 18-hour shift monitoring the forge's expansion. "Not once. Because they already believe they know the answer. They think we're doing exactly as much as the treaty allows because that's the most we're capable of. It never occurs to them that a species might hold back on purpose." "That's the whole plan," Marcus said. "Let them believe what they already believe. It's the easiest lie in the world to tell." By the start of the fourth year, the 6 forge sites had grown large enough to begin producing not just raw hull material and components, but complete warships, built to a design that had gone through 3 full revisions as human engineers, freed from the treaty's restrictions because nothing about the forge was registered under it, pushed the technology far beyond what the original Velforge fragments had described. The ship class they settled on, the Vindication, was built around a principle that Marcus called asymmetric design. Rather than trying to match Concorde warships gun for gun, armor for armor, human engineers built ships optimized for exactly the kind of fight humanity was likely to face. Concorde doctrine, learned from 3,000 years of conquering species that fought with older, slower technology, emphasized overwhelming mass and firepower delivered at a comfortable distance, confident that no enemy could close that distance fast enough to matter. The Vindication class was built to close that distance in seconds rather than minutes, using a modified reactionless drive system reverse-engineered from Velforge propulsion fragments, then improved by a team of human physicists who did not know it was supposed to be impossible to improve. The ships also carried weapons systems built around technology the Concorde had never seen, because it had never needed to develop it. Adaptive plasma lances that could reconfigure their focus mid-battle, based on real-time feedback from the target's armor composition, a system that took 2 full years of failed prototypes before a young weapons engineer named Diego Reyes finally solved the feedback loop problem that had stumped the rest of the team. The Concorde builds ships to fight species that fight the way the Concorde expects them to fight, Diego said, during a presentation to Elena Voss and the Joint Chiefs in the 4th year, when the first working prototype of the adaptive lance was finally ready for testing. They've had 3,000 years to perfect that kind of war. We don't have 3,000 years, so we're not going to try to win that kind of war. We're going to make sure the war we fight is a war they've never seen before. By the time the shipyards went dark, 11 days before Ambassador Kalith Dronin received his fateful report, the forge had produced the components for 12 complete. Vindication. Class cruisers, with 60 more in various stages of construction, and manufacturing capacity continuing to double roughly every 2 months as new forge cells came online across all 6 continents. The decision to shut down the surface shipyards had not been made lightly. For 4 years, those yards had served their purpose, giving the Concorde a reassuring picture of a species building slowly, cautiously, exactly at the edge of what the treaty allowed. But Marcus and his team had reached a point where the forge's underground facilities could produce everything Earth needed, without any further need for the surface yards' slower, more visible work. Continuing to run them meant continuing to spend resources on a deception that had already served its purpose, resources that could instead accelerate the forge's growth even further. There was also, Elena admitted to herself in private, a part of the decision that was almost emotional rather than purely strategic. 4 years of watching Concorde inspectors walk through Meridian Station with barely concealed condescension had worn on her more than she liked to admit. Some part of her wanted to see what the Concorde would do when they thought the last of humanity's visible strength had finally crumbled. Some part of her wanted to watch them celebrate before showing them exactly how wrong they were. "It's a risk," Marcus warned her, in the final planning session before the shutdown order went out. "The moment those yards go dark, the Concorde is going to draw conclusions. We're betting everything on the idea that the conclusion they draw is weakness, not deception." "They will," Elena said, with a certainty she had earned across 4 years of watching Concorde officers underestimate every single thing about the human species. "Because that's the only conclusion that fits what they already believe about us. A species like the Concorde doesn't consider the possibility that a younger, weaker species might be capable of deceiving them. It's not in their nature to imagine that a species they see as a child might be playing a longer game than they are." She was right, and Sassafel, watching from her quarters in the Forge's central command facility, allowed herself something the Trenai rarely showed to outsiders, a small, private hope that after 200 years of watching this pattern repeat itself across dozens of conquered worlds, she might finally see it broken, once, by a species stubborn enough to refuse the ending the Concorde had already written for them. 11 days after the shutdown, Concorde sensor drones confirmed exactly the conclusion Elena had predicted. 3 days after that, 2 Concorde fleets began moving towards Sol, confident they were about to deliver the final blow to a broken and defenseless world. Beneath 6 continents, the Forge kept growing, and the first 12. Vindication. Class cruisers finished their final systems checks, waiting for the order that would send them into space for the first time, not as a secret anymore, but as an answer to 6 years of quiet, patient humiliation. The order to launch went out at 0400 hours Eastern Time, though there was no sunrise beneath 6 continents to mark the moment, only the steady hum of machinery that had waited 4 years for this exact instant. Marcus Chen stood in the primary control room of the Nevada Forge, watching the countdown on the main screen tick toward 0, flanked by Priya Nair and a dozen other engineers who had spent years of their lives on a project most of them had never been allowed to tell their families about. Some of them had missed weddings, some had missed the births of their children. All of them had signed away 6 years of ordinary life for this single moment. 30 seconds, Priya said, her voice tight with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. The Meridian's answer. Sat in a launch cavern carved from bedrock 2 kilometers beneath the Nevada desert, its black hull catching the reflected light of the cavern's work lamps, 400 meters of warship that had never existed on any Concorde sensor log, any treaty registry, any diplomatic report. Above it, a massive door built into the cavern's ceiling, disguised on the surface as a natural rock formation, reinforced decades earlier, as part of an unrelated mining project, began to grind open. 10 seconds, Priya said. 9, 8. Marcus found himself thinking, in that strange way that minds wander at the most important moments, of the day Sassafel had first sat across the table from Elena Voss and described a pattern of conquest that had repeated itself across dozens of worlds. He thought of every Concord inspector who had walked through Meridian Station with a barely hidden sneer, counting hulls they believed represented the full extent of human ambition. He thought of 6 years of pretending, 6 years of small humiliations, swallowed for the sake of a larger plan. 3, 2, 1. The Meridian's answer. Lifted off the cavern floor without sound, without the roar of chemical engines that had once defined human spaceflight, rising on a field of modified reactionless drive technology that pushed against the fabric of space itself, rather than against exhaust gas. It rose through the opening cavern ceiling into the pale gray light of early morning over the Nevada desert, and for the first time in 4 years, a Velforge-derived warship saw open sky. Within the hour, 11 more. Vindication. Class cruisers launched from 5 other Forge sites scattered across the globe, 2 more from beneath the Nevada desert, 3 from the Icelandic facility, 2 from the Andes, 2 from a site beneath the Australian outback, and 2 from a facility hidden deep in the mountains of Central Asia that even most of Project Anvil's own personnel had never known existed. 12 ships. It was not, by Concord standards, an overwhelming force. 2 Concord fleets, over 400 warships combined, were already 3 days into their journey toward Seoul, confident and unhurried, expecting no resistance at all. 12 human cruisers, however advanced, would not by themselves be enough to stop that many ships through simple weight of numbers. But Marcus and Elena had never intended the first 12 ships to fight that battle alone. Forge production is accelerating, Marcus reported to Elena during the emergency Joint Chiefs briefing that followed the first launch, 3 hours later, in a secure facility beneath the Pentagon that had been retrofitted years earlier, specifically to receive updates from Project Anvil. With all 6 sites now openly producing rather than maintaining cover operations, we're seeing manufacturing capacity nearly triple. At current rates, we'll have 36 operational. Vindication. Class cruisers within 72 hours, 60 within a week. The Concord fleets will reach Seoul in 4 days, said General Reyes Alvarez, the Joint Chiefs chairman, a stern man who had spent the last 4 years as one of only a dozen people outside Project Anvil, cleared to know its full scope. That gives us roughly 36 ships when they arrive, against 400 of theirs. 36 ships that outclass anything in their fleet on an individual basis, Marcus said. But you're right that the numbers still favor them heavily. That's why the plan was never to win with the first wave alone. Elena Voss stood and walked to the tactical display showing the projected positions of both Concord fleets, their courses converging steadily toward Seoul. Sassafel warned us, the Concord fights with overwhelming mass, because 3,000 years of conquest have taught them that overwhelming mass always wins eventually, against anyone slower to adapt. We're not going to fight that kind of battle. We're going to fight the kind of battle where speed and unpredictability matter more than raw numbers, buying time for the Forge to keep producing, until the numbers stop mattering at all. The plan that followed had been wargamed for 2 years inside Project Anvil's own simulation systems, refined against every scenario the team's small circle of former Concord defectors could imagine, including detailed input from Sassafel herself, who understood Concord battle doctrine better than any human alive. The core of the plan was deception, layered upon deception. The first 12. Vindication. Cruisers would not meet the Concord fleets head-on in open battle. Instead, they would use their superior speed and a stealth technology adapted from Velforge sensor-dampening fragments to conduct a campaign of harassment, striking isolated elements of the Concord fleet, destroying support ships and scouts, then withdrawing before the main body of either fleet could bring its full weight to bear. Every hour the Concord spent chasing phantoms and hunting for an enemy that refused to stand and fight in the way Concord doctrine expected was an hour the Forge spent producing more ships. They will adapt eventually, Sassafel warned during the final planning session, speaking through a translation device that had improved considerably over 4 years, but still occasionally struggled with the particular cadence of human military jargon. The Concorde's greatest strength is not any single weapon or tactic. It is patience, and the ability to learn from failure across a battle that has lasted 3,000 years. Do not expect them to remain confused for the full duration of this fight. Expect them to recognize the pattern of harassment within days, perhaps hours, and adjust their formation to counter it. That's fine, Elena said. We only need them confused long enough. 3 days after the first launch, as the Concorde fleets crossed into the outer edges of the Sol system, the Meridian's answer, and 3 sister ships made first contact with a Concorde scout formation, patrolling the approach to Jupiter's orbit. What followed was not a battle in any sense the Concorde scouts understood. The 4. Vindication. Cruisers dropped out of stealth less than 30 kilometers from the Concorde formation, close enough that the reactionless drive's near-instant acceleration profile closed the gap before the scouts' point defense systems could properly calibrate against targets moving in ways their sensors had never modeled. Adaptive plasma lances, tuned in real time to the specific armor composition of Concorde hull plating, cut through defenses designed to withstand weapons that behaved the way Concorde engineers expected enemy weapons to behave. Within 90 seconds, 6 Concorde scout vessels were destroyed or crippled. The 4. Vindication. Cruisers vanished back into stealth before the rest of the Concorde fleet, 30 light minutes away, even received the distress call. Ambassador Kalith Dronin received word of the ambush 4 hours later, and for the first time since the shipyards had gone dark, a note of uncertainty crept into his four-eyed gaze. "Explain this," he said to the fleet's tactical officer, a chitter commander named Vestak, whose armored carapace clicked with agitation as he reviewed the sensor logs. "You told me the human fleet was broken. Their shipyards were dark, their economy in ruins." "Their surface shipyards were dark, Ambassador," Vestak said. "The vessels that attacked our scouts do not match any known human ship class in our registry. Their acceleration profile is inconsistent with any human propulsion technology we have previously encountered. Their weapons behavior is unlike anything in our combat archives." "Then where," Kalith said slowly, "did these ships come from?" It was a question that would take the Concorde Fleet Command 3 more days and the loss of over 20 additional ships to begin answering properly, and by the time they had assembled enough data to understand they were facing an entirely new class of human warship, the Forge's production numbers had already crossed 40 operational cruisers, with more finishing final assembly every few hours. Kalith convened an emergency council aboard the Silent Judgment. The mood in the chamber considerably less celebratory than it had been just a week earlier. The Kargan delegate, who had argued most forcefully for immediate and total invasion, now argued with equal force that the fleet should halt its advance until Concorde intelligence could properly assess the new threat. "We came here to correct a weakened species," the Kargan delegate said, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to wounded pride. "Now our scouts report ships that should not exist, built with technology our own analysts cannot fully classify. I ask again, Ambassador, where did a broken economy find the resources to build vessels beyond our own registry?" Kalith did not have a satisfying answer, and it troubled him more than he let show in the council chamber. He ordered a full halt of the fleet's advance at the edge of the Sol system, a decision that bought humanity 2 additional critical days, and dispatched additional scout formations, heavily escorted this time, to determine the true scope of what they were facing. Those scouts found nothing conclusive, because by then, the Vindication. Cruisers had shifted tactics again, striking supply convoys at the fleet's rear rather than its forward elements, forcing the Concorde to divide its already cautious advance across multiple fronts simultaneously. "They are fighting a war of patience against us," Kalith finally admitted to his war council, 5 days after the first ambush, standing before a tactical map that showed Concorde losses mounting steadily, despite no direct engagement with the human main fleet, whatever and wherever it might be. "A war of patience is the one form of war. The Concorde has always been assured of winning, because we have always been the older, more patient party in every conflict we have fought. I do not know what to make of a species patient enough to outwait us at our own game." He did not yet know how right he was to be uncertain, because the true scale of Project Anvil had not yet been revealed at all. The Forge, freed from 4 years of careful concealment, was accelerating its production far beyond what even Marcus Chen's most optimistic projections had suggested, drawing on manufacturing cells that had been quietly multiplying beneath 6 continents for years before the first. Vindication. Cruiser ever left its cavern. By the 10th day since the first launch, Earth's hidden fleet numbered 94 operational warships, no longer just vindication class cruisers, but the first examples of a larger design, the Sovereign class battleship, 600 meters of adaptive plasma weaponry and reactionless drive technology, refined through 10 days of real combat data, gathered from every skirmish the smaller cruisers had fought. Elena Voss stood before Marcus Chen and the assembled Joint Chiefs in the underground command center beneath the Pentagon, reviewing the latest production figures with an expression that had shifted, over 10 days, from cautious hope to something closer to grim certainty. "They've halted their advance at the edge of the system," she said, tracing the frozen Concorde fleet positions on the tactical display. "They're afraid, and they're right to be afraid, though they still don't understand exactly why yet. Marcus, how many more days until the forge reaches full projected capacity?" 3 more days, Marcus said. "After that, we stop counting individual ships and start counting fleets." Elena nodded slowly, and for the first time in 6 years, allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to stop pretending to be weak. "Then in 3 days," she said, "we show them exactly what they were celebrating." 3 days passed like the longest 3 days of Marcus Chen's life, though he spent almost none of them sleeping, and all of them watching production numbers climb on a screen that had not stopped updating since the first launch. By the 13th day since the Meridian's answer rose out of the Nevada desert, the forge's combined output across 6 continents had produced 180 operational warships, 110 vindication class cruisers, 62 of the newer Sovereign class battleships, and 8 massive vessels of an entirely new design that Marcus's team had only finished testing 4 days earlier, a class they had named, with a certain grim humor that had become common among people who had spent 6 years living a double life, the Reckoning class dreadnought. Each Reckoning class ship was nearly 1.5 kilometers long, built around a central spine of fusion reactors that powered an array of adaptive plasma lances large enough to punch through the heaviest Concorde armor in a single shot, wrapped in layers of the same matte black hull material that had defined every ship the Forge produced, a material developed by a materials scientist named Dr. Wen Lu, specifically to absorb and diffuse the kind of long-range sensor pulses the Concorde relied on to track enemy positions from a comfortable distance. "They still don't have a clear count of our numbers," Priya Nair reported to Marcus and Elena during the final planning session before what everyone in the room had started calling, without any official order to do so, the reveal. "Every engagement they've had with us has been against small formations using stealth technology they can't fully penetrate. Their intelligence estimates, based on intercepted communications, still place our total fleet strength somewhere between 20 and 40 ships." "Then they're about to be very surprised," Elena said. Ambassador Kaleth Dronan, aboard the Silent Judgment, had spent 13 days watching his war council grow increasingly divided between those who wanted to press forward despite the losses and those who argued, with growing desperation, for a full withdrawal back to Concorde space. The Concorde fleet had lost 31 ships in a dozen scattered engagements against an enemy they had never fully located, let alone defeated in open battle. 31 ships was not, by itself, a crippling loss for a fleet of over 400, but the manner of those losses, the complete inability to bring the human fleet to a decisive engagement, had shaken Concorde confidence far more than the raw numbers suggested. "We came to correct a broken species," Kaleth said to his assembled council on the 14th day, standing before the same tactical map that had shown so little useful information for 2 weeks. "Instead, we have spent 2 weeks chasing an enemy we cannot find, losing ships to weapons we cannot fully classify. I have sent 3 requests to the High Council for reinforcement. I have received no answer, which I take to mean the High Council does not yet believe the situation warrants the diversion of additional fleets from other operations." "Then we should withdraw," said Vestak, the Chitter tactical officer, his earlier confidence long since replaced by the careful caution of an officer who had watched too many of his own scout formations vanish into stealth ambushes that left no survivors to properly report what had happened. "We do not understand what we are facing, Ambassador. Continuing to press forward without understanding the enemy is not caution, it is recklessness. Withdrawal is not without its own cost," Calith said. "If we retreat now, having lost 31 ships to an enemy we cannot even properly identify, every species in the Concord Coalition will ask why the Ashen Concord fled from a species we ourselves described as broken and defenseless only 2 weeks earlier. Our reputation is not a small thing, Commander. It is the foundation of 3,000 years of expansion, built on the understanding that no species successfully resists the Concord for long. It was, in the end, a question of pride as much as strategy, and pride made the decision for him." Calith ordered the combined fleet to advance on Earth itself, reasoning that whatever hidden force the humans had assembled, a direct assault on the home system would force the enemy to finally commit to open battle, ending the frustrating campaign of ambush and retreat that had cost the Concord so much for so little visible gain. It was exactly the decision Elena Voss and Marcus Chen had spent 13 days hoping he would make. "They're moving on Earth directly," reported Colonel James Osei, Amara's younger brother, and the officer responsible for coordinating sensor data from Earth's remaining orbital defense network, during the final briefing before the reveal. "Full combined fleet, 369 confirmed warships, entering final approach toward Earth orbit. Estimated arrival in 18 hours. Elena looked around the room at the faces of people who had spent 6 years, in one way or another, building toward this exact moment. Marcus Chen, who had turned encrypted alien fragments into a technology capable of rebuilding an entire species' industrial base in secret. Priya Nair, who had spent 3 sleepless days managing the first Forge launch. Diego Reyes, whose adaptive plasma lance had turned every human warship into something the Concord's own weapons experts could not properly classify. Dr. Amara Osei, whose understanding of geophysics had hidden 6 Forge facilities from the eyes of an entire galactic coalition for 4 years. And Sassafel, the Trenai defector who had started all of it with a single conversation across a metal table, 200 years into her own long life, and 6 years into humanity's. 18 hours, Elena said. "Marcus, what's our final count?" "As of this hour," Marcus said, checking the latest figures scrolling across his tablet. 240 ships fully operational and combat ready. Another 40 finishing final systems checks that should complete within the next 12 hours. Call it 280 ships by the time the Concord fleet arrives. 280 against 369, Elena said. "Still not even numbers." "No," Marcus agreed. "But they're not our numbers either. Every ship in the Forge is built to fight the way the Concord doesn't expect anyone to fight. Sassafel, you've seen more Concord battles than any of us. What's your assessment?" Sassafel considered the question for a long moment, her pale gold eyes moving across the tactical display, with the particular focus of someone who had spent 200 years learning to read the shape of a battle before it began. "The Concord's confidence has always rested on the assumption that no enemy can close the distance fast enough to make their weight of numbers irrelevant. Your ships close that distance faster than anything they have ever faced. If your pilots and gunnery crews execute the tactics you have trained for as well as your simulations suggest, the battle will not be decided by which fleet has more ships. It will be decided by which fleet can force a decisive engagement on its own terms before the other adapts." "Then let's make sure it's our terms," Elena said. The final 18 hours passed in a blur of preparation that Marcus would later remember only in fragments, the last systems checks on the newest. Reckoning. Class dreadnoughts, the careful positioning of the full fleet in a formation designed months earlier, in simulations that had never quite captured the reality of what was about to happen. The strange quiet that settled over the underground command center in the final hour before contact, as if everyone involved understood that 6 years of secrecy and sacrifice were about to be measured against a single day. The Concord fleet dropped out of its final approach vector at the edge of Earth's orbital defense perimeter. 369 warships arrayed in the wide, confident formation of a coalition that had conquered dozens of worlds and expected this one to fall the same way all the others had. Ambassador Calith Dronan stood on the bridge of the Silent Judgment. watching sensor feeds that showed Earth's orbital space ahead, still calm, still apparently undefended by anything beyond the scattered remnants of the small fleet that had harassed them for 2 weeks. Sensor sweep of Earth orbital space, Kalith ordered. Confirm defensive positions. The report that came back a moment later would be the last piece of intelligence Kalith Dronan received, before the true scale of Project Anvil revealed itself all at once. Sensors detecting minimal defensive presence in Earth orbital space, Ambassador, Vestak reported, and there was a note of confusion in his translated voice, the confusion of a tactical officer who had expected, after 2 weeks of costly and inconclusive skirmishing, to finally see the full shape of the enemy fleet arrayed before him. No significant warship concentrations detected within. The reactionless drive technology built into every ship the Forge had produced was capable of an acceleration profile that no Concorde sensor array had been designed to properly track, because no species the Concorde had encountered in 3,000 years had ever needed to hide a fleet this large, this close to a target this important. 280 warships, arrayed in a formation designed by human tacticians who had spent 6 years studying every Concorde engagement doctrine Sassafel could recall, dropped out of stealth simultaneously, at a distance of less than 200 kilometers from the Concorde fleet's forward elements, a distance that gave Concorde point defense systems, calibrated for engagements at ranges measured in thousands of kilometers, almost no time to respond at all. Aboard the silent judgment. Alarms that had been silent for 2 weeks of frustrating, inconclusive skirmishing suddenly screamed with an intensity that Kalith Dronan had not heard since the darkest days of the First Contact War 6 years earlier. Multiple contacts, Vestak shouted, his earlier composure completely gone, replaced by something that, in a chitter officer, passed for open alarm. 200, no, correcting, 280, confirmed human warships, dropping out of stealth across our entire forward formation. Classification includes numerous vessels, of a size and configuration that do not match any human ship class in our registry. Ambassador, this is not the fleet we expected to face. Kalith Dronan stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching a tactical display suddenly filled with warships that should not have existed, built by a species he and every member of the Concorde High Council had convinced themselves was too young, too broken, too fundamentally limited to ever pose a serious threat, and understood, in the space of a single terrible moment, exactly how thoroughly he had been deceived. They were never broken, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone on the bridge around him. The shipyards did not go dark because they had failed. They went dark because they no longer needed them. He had perhaps 3 seconds to consider the full weight of that realization, before the first wave of adaptive plasma lances, tuned in real time against the specific armor composition of every Concorde ship in range, began to fire. The battle above Earth would later be studied by military historians of a dozen species for generations, though in the moment itself, it did not feel like history to anyone fighting it. It felt like chaos. Controlled chaos on the human side, uncontrolled chaos on the Concorde side. And the difference between the two was the difference the entire battle turned on. Aboard the Meridian's answer. Still leading the fleet, she had been the first ship to represent 2 weeks earlier. Captain Rosa Delgado watched her tactical display fill with the burning wreckage of Concorde ships that had never had time to properly calibrate their defenses against an enemy that appeared, by every standard the Concorde's own sensors used to measure such things, out of nowhere. Adaptive lances are reading full effectiveness across the fleet, her weapons officer reported, disbelief evident in his voice, despite months of simulations that had predicted exactly this outcome. Enemy point defense is failing to track our fire solutions. They're not adjusting fast enough. They've never had to adjust this fast before, Rosa said. Keep pressing. Diego's team built these weapons to punish exactly this kind of hesitation. 280 human warships, moving with an acceleration and maneuverability that Concorde doctrine had never accounted for, tore through the Concorde fleet's forward formation in the first 90 seconds of engagement, with a ferocity that stunned even the human crews who had trained for this exact scenario for months. By the time Concorde point defense systems began to properly recalibrate against the unfamiliar threat profile, 41 Concorde warships had already been destroyed or crippled beyond combat effectiveness. Ambassador Kalith Dronan, aboard the silent judgment. Watch the opening minutes of the battle, with the particular horror of a commander realizing, in real time, that every assumption underpinning his strategy had been wrong. "Fall back to defensive formation," he ordered, his translated voice tight with a controlled panic that Vestak, standing beside him, had never heard from the ambassador in over a decade of service together. "Concentrate point defense. Bring the Ninth Fleet's reserve elements forward, to reinforce the center." The order came too late to matter for the ships already caught in the human fleet's initial assault, but it did begin, slowly, to stabilize the Concorde formation against further losses, and for the next 2 hours, the battle above Earth settled into something closer to the grinding, attrition-based engagement that Concorde doctrine had always been built to win. Numbers began to matter more as both fleets adjusted to the reality of the fight, and the human fleet, despite the devastating effectiveness of its opening assault, was still outnumbered by nearly 90 ships. It was in this second phase of the battle, as the initial shock of the human fleet's reveal began to fade, and Concorde numbers began to reassert themselves, that the true purpose of the reckoning class dreadnoughts became clear. The 8 dreadnoughts, held in reserve during the initial assault specifically to preserve the element of surprise for as long as possible, moved into the heart of the battle 2 hours after first contact. Their kilometer-and-a-half-long hulls, absorbing Concorde fire, that would have crippled any of the smaller cruisers. Their massive adaptive plasma arrays, tearing through Concorde capital ships, with a single sustained shot, that no Concorde vessel in the fleet had armor thick enough to survive. Elena Voss, watching the battle unfold from the underground command center beneath the Pentagon, through a live feed relayed from Earth's orbital sensor network, felt something in her chest loosen, for the first time in 6 years, as she watched the reckoning class dreadnought Defiance punch a hole clean through the hull of a Concorde battleship 3 times its own displacement. "Marcus," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off the display, "how many Concorde ships have we lost?" 12, Marcus said, his own voice hoarse from hours of monitoring the battle without pause. 12 of ours against 106 of theirs, as of the last update. Aboard the silent judgment. Ambassador Kalith Dronan watched those same numbers with a growing, sick certainty that the battle, and perhaps the entire 6-year strategy of patient strangulation the Concorde had pursued against Earth, had already been lost. He had entered this engagement believing he faced a species too weak to resist a final, decisive show of force. He was instead watching a species that had spent 6 years hiding an industrial capacity beyond anything the Concorde had encountered from a young civilization in 3,000 years of careful, patient expansion. "Ambassador," Vestak said, 4 hours into the battle, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of an officer who had watched his fleet reduced by nearly half. "The Third Fleet's remaining ships are requesting permission to withdraw. Continued engagement risks total loss of remaining combat strength." Kalith Dronan stood in silence for a long moment, watching a tactical display that told a story he had never imagined he would witness. A species the Concorde had celebrated as broken and defeated, revealed instead as an opponent that had turned 6 years of patient humiliation into 6 years of patient preparation, waiting for exactly this moment to show the Concorde precisely how thoroughly it had misjudged them. "Order a full withdrawal," Kalith said finally, the words costing him more than any decision he had made in over a century of Concorde service. "All remaining ships, fall back to the rally point at the edge of the system. We are finished here." The retreat, when it came, was not orderly. 231 Concorde warships, all that remained of a combined fleet of 369, fled the battle above Earth in a scattered, disorganized withdrawal that human forces harried for nearly an hour before Elena Voss gave the order to let them go, satisfied that the point had been made as thoroughly as it needed to be. "Let them run," she said, when Rosa Delgado requested permission to continue pursuit. "We don't need to destroy their entire fleet today. We need them to go home and tell every species in that coalition exactly what they saw here." The battle above Earth ended 6 hours after it began, with 138 Concorde warships destroyed against 19 human losses, a ratio so lopsided that Concorde tacticians would spend years afterward trying to understand exactly how thoroughly their doctrine had failed against an enemy prepared, in ways no species had ever prepared before, to fight a war the Concorde had never imagined losing. Ambassador Kalith Dronan returned to Concord space aboard the battered remnant of the Silent Judgment and delivered, in person, a report to the full Concord High Council that would echo through the coalition for years afterward. He described a species that had spent 6 years pretending to comply with treaty restrictions, while secretly building an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything the Concord had encountered, from a civilization less than a century into spaceflight. He described weapons systems built around principles the Concord's own engineers could not fully explain, ships that moved and fought in ways no Concord doctrine had ever prepared for, and a defeat so total that it called into question 3,000 years of assumptions about how conquest was supposed to work against young, developing species. The High Council's response was, in the end, exactly what Sasafel had hoped for 200 years and 6 years earlier, when she first sat across a metal table from Elena Voss and offered fragments of technology that would eventually become humanity's answer to a pattern of quiet conquest she had watched repeat itself across too many worlds to count. Within a month of the battle, the Ashen Concord formally withdrew every trade restriction, every shipbuilding quota, every condescending inspection regime it had imposed on Earth for 6 years, not out of generosity, but out of a newly urgent fear that a species capable of what Earth had just demonstrated was not a species worth provoking further. Diplomatic communications from the Concord grew notably more careful, more respectful, and considerably less inclined toward the particular condescension that had once characterized every interaction between Concord officials and human representatives. Elena Voss stood beside Marcus Chen 6 months after the battle, watching the newest Reckoning Class Dreadnought complete its final systems checks in a forge facility that no longer needed to hide from anyone. The forge had continued growing in the months since the battle, no longer a secret project buried beneath 6 continents, but the open, celebrated foundation of a rapidly expanding human presence beyond Earth's own solar system, a presence that other young species across the galaxy, species that had once faced the same quiet, patient strangulation the Concord had tried against Earth, had begun quietly reaching out to for help of their own. Sasafel's people, Marcus said, looking out over the forge facility that had once been humanity's most closely guarded secret. She says there are others, other species the Concord ground down slowly over centuries, the way they tried to grind us down, species that never had a forge of their own to hide. Then maybe, Elena said, it's time we stopped hiding ours. Sasafel, standing nearby, allowed herself, for the first time in 200 years, of watching the same pattern repeat across dozens of conquered worlds, something that felt, to her long Trenai memory, almost like hope. The Concord believed, she said quietly, that patience always belongs to the older, more established power, that a young species can be worn down slowly enough that it never notices its own strength slipping away, until nothing is left but quiet obedience. You have shown them something they had forgotten was possible, that patience can belong to the young as well, if they are stubborn enough, and clever enough, and willing to wait as long as it takes. Far above the desert where it all began, the newest ships of humanity's fleet rose into open sky, no longer hidden, no longer pretending, carrying with them the memory of 6 years spent quietly building strength beneath the eyes of a coalition that had celebrated too soon, and had learned, in the end, exactly what humanity had launched.